We now have the unique distinction, or I would say dishonor, of being the world's leading incarceration state.
Peace talks never happen without more Israeli settlements, which means more and more Israel.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 22 cable stations from Vermont to New York City. On the internet at thestruggle.org. Our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. On March 29th, activists who defend your constitutional rights held a conference called One Nation Under Surveillance. We've already shown you parts of the keynote address by Chris Hedges. Today we'll have a conference introduction by Attorney Peter Goselin and a talk by Professor Kalilah Brown-Dean, who's the author of a book called Once Convicted, Forever Doomed. The peace talks between the Israeli apartheid regime and Mahmoud Abbas have collapsed once again. Rather than make any comment, we'll show two satirical videos about the peace process farce produced by Apartheid Adventures. We begin with Peter Goselin, who's a member of the National Lawyers Guild.
Over the last decade or so, at the same time that technology has provided us with access to huge archives of human knowledge and cat videos, it has also made possible the ability of the government and of big corporations that act like governments to conduct surveillance of individuals, their activities, their movements, their communications with other people in ways and at a level that was previously unimaginable. And as the extent of this surveillance has become known, thanks especially to the courageous actions of people like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden and many others, there are three responses that have emerged. And I think we have to take a look at these different responses and think about them as activists, as individuals, as activists, as members of movements, evaluate these responses and think about how we want to respond and what direction we want to go in. Now, first of all, there are folks who believe that government surveillance right now is an all-powerful techno-military machine. It spies on each and every one of us all the time. These are basically the same folks who think that, that there are little things in our dollar bills that let the government track us, conspiracy theorists and folks like that. And, I like a good conspiracy as well as the next person, but the problem with this perspective is that it's basically a defeatist perspective. It assumes that the government and the corporations are so all-powerful that they can't be resisted and that these trends can't be fought. And I think it ignores history. It ignores the admonition of the poet Bertolt Brecht, who said many years ago now, "General, your tank is a powerful vehicle. It smashes down forests and crushes 100 men. But it has one defect. It needs a driver." And when we see what people like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning have done, and when we see the folks who are fighting back against the subpoenas of anti-war activists, the grand jury subpoenas in the Midwest, when we see the struggles that are going on in so many areas, we see that even though there is this huge machine that appears intent on crushing us, that appears to have the ability to interfere in our lives and in our struggles in so many different ways. It has one defect. It needs a driver. It needs people who are willing to carry out its will. And those people are people like us. They are people who have hearts and souls like ours. And it is not conceivable to me that the kind of surveillance and repression that the government forces on us is capable of overcoming the goodwill of those people and of us. So let's do away with conspiracy theories and talk about how it's too late to do anything because the technology of the man is all-powerful. Now, there's a second group. Mostly, maybe even some folks that people here know, they're liberals or they're progressives. I call them the folks who should know better. Now, they're the ones who have been telling us that, after all, there are a lot of bad people out there intent on doing bad things, and the government's there to protect us. And you know what? And I have to say, I was surprised the first time I heard this coming from somebody who styled themselves as a progressive. You know what? If you haven't done anything wrong, you don't have anything to hide. Now, I do have to say, it's not clear to me yet, when we talk about folks who kind of fit into this box, whether this is a permanent mindset or whether it's merely a matter of political expedience. I say that because it seems pretty clear to me that an awful lot of these folks would have been horrified if they had heard someone say that in defense of government surveillance policies under President Bush, and yet they appear to think that it's a reasonable defense of President Obama's policies. And I think we have to reject this perspective as well, that excuses spying, destruction of civil liberties, destruction of human lives in the name of political expedience, or even worse, in the name of a kind of collaborationism, going along to get along, selling out in exchange for a few political favors or a little bit of political pull. Now, fortunately, I said there are three perspectives. There's a third perspective. And guess what? Lucky you, you're part of it. You wouldn't be here if you weren't part of it. These are the folks who see the danger that we are facing, understand that it's real, that it's not a conspiracy, but it's the way things work, that it has a history, and that the resistance to it has a history as well. Professor Kalilah Brown-Dean is an associate professor of political science at Quinnipiac University here in Connecticut. She was formerly an assistant professor at Yale University. She is, as I said, she is the author of Once Committed, Forever Doomed, Race, Crime.
To be completely honest, when I was first approached about presenting, my initial thought was why? Why the work that I do? How is that relevant to the topic for this conference? But as I began to think about the broader question, I realized that there are few institutions in this country that have eroded our democratic rights more than the criminal justice system. Mass incarceration is about much more than just punishing those who have broken the law. Mass incarceration has deteriorated our entire community structure. Everything from the value of our vote, to whether we can serve on a jury, to whether we can volunteer in our children's schools, and even how we labor and give birth is defined by the carceral state. So today I want to talk about a few of those connections and then suggest some plans for action. What we know is that since the 1970s, the incarceration population in this country has increased nearly sixfold. We now have the unique distinction, or I would say dishonor, of being the world's leading incarceration state. We comprise 5% of the world's total population, but over 25% of all people behind bars in the world are incarcerated here in the United States. Not just American citizens, but residents as well. What we also know is that the United States locks up more people per incident than any other country. So even when we control for crime rates, we still focus on mass incarceration. In my book, I talk about the fact that it's not about crime, it's really about policy. And so that's why the focus for me is on punishment, because we know crime rates have gone down, yet we have ramped up these penalties and played on the fears of the American people. Mass incarceration has had a disproportionate impact on communities of color. Blacks make up about 12% of the total US population, but are 60% of all Americans behind bars. 1 in 3 young black men in this country can expect to go to prison at some point in his lifetime. Now, I am a political scientist. I think everything is political, and I thrive on understanding politics. But what I also know is that crime has been the one issue area that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree upon. Both parties seem dead set on being tough on crime without being smart on crime. So that this path to hyper-incarceration started under a Republican president, Richard Nixon, who launched the Law and Order campaign not in response to violence and to crime, but in response to mass mobilization. So that as urban communities in places like Detroit and LA rioted because they realized the victories of the civil rights movement had not been realized, Nixon responded with the Law and Order campaign. It was expanded by Ronald Reagan during the war on drugs effort, but it was solidified under a Democratic president, being Bill Clinton. So what do we know? 20 years ago, Bill Clinton signs into law a sweeping welfare reform bill that vowed to change welfare as we knew it, but it did much more than that. That one act of legislation imperiled the lives not just of people who had gotten in trouble with the law, but of families and communities as well. So that now mothers across the country have to make the tough decision. Do I allow my juvenile child to come and live in the home with us in public housing? Or do I risk being thrown out because of that? These collateral consequences of a conviction, and often not just a conviction, but the suspicion of a crime, means that if you have a felony conviction, you can't live in public housing. You cannot receive funding for higher education. You cannot hold certain jobs. So you can't be a barber, you can't be a plumber, you can't be a beautician if you have a felony conviction. This is why I talk about the cycle in my book, so that you've paid your debt to society, you've been released from prison, but now you cannot hold a job in a field that ironically you are trained for in prison. So that many of our vocational programs here in Connecticut focus on hospitality management. Connecticut, if you have a felony, you can't work in a restaurant, you can't work in a hotel because they serve alcohol. Where then are our priorities to break that cycle and to help people contribute to their families and strengthen those communities? So often when we talk about mass incarceration, we talk about the astounding number of Black men who are involved with that system. But what we must begin to talk about is the fact that African American women now represent the fastest growing prison population in this country. The majority of those women have been convicted of a nonviolent drug offense. Women also have a higher likelihood of being incarcerated pre-trial, not because they are a greater threat to themselves or to their communities, but because they cannot afford to make bail. In Massachusetts, 85% of the women who have been held had bails of less than $1,000. Does it make us safer when we allow poverty to determine freedom? So the increased incarceration of women is particularly damaging to families and communities. Across this country, 60% of the women now in prison were the custodial parent for a minor child. That means that as more women have gone into prison in this country, the number of children going into foster care has also increased. Most of those children are children of color. Social workers will tell you that children of color, Black and Latino children, have a very low likelihood of being adopted out of the system. It's a basic law of supply and demand. Black and brown babies are cheaper to adopt because there's less demand for them. What does it say about our collective humanity when we have allowed mass incarceration to dictate the value and the worth of our children? When do we fight against that? The fact that 250,000 children have gone into foster care because of the war on drugs. Who is going to speak on behalf of those children? Educators know that children with an incarcerated parent are more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety, more likely to develop a learning disability or have problems with anger management. And so the children who get channeled not in schools but into the prison pipeline often do so because there's turmoil at home. Here again, we see the community-wide effects of mass incarceration. So part of the benefit of being on a college campus is that my students are very into social media, and they sent this picture to me, and I don't know if you can see on the bottom, but the words say, one of these is a convicted felon. Which one, right? So for those of you who are not up on pop culture, that is a hip-hop artist formerly known as Snoop Dogg, now known as Snoop Lion, and that is Martha Stewart, right, Connecticut's own. When Martha Stewart released her first cookbook in 1984, there were approximately 12,000 women behind bars. As I said, the rate and increase of women behind bars is nearly double that increase for men. So what does that mean? It means that most states don't have the facilities to house all of those women. So states realized if we don't have enough facilities here, let's send those women to other states to serve their time. So you had women being taken from places like Connecticut and sent to my home state of Virginia, to Texas, to Colorado to serve their time. Virginia loved that because they got $30,000 per inmate per year. They got to count those women in their census, and that is why Virginia received more money from the federal government than Connecticut did. Right? It's not just about a transfer of human capital, as analysts like to use that term, but it's also about understanding what that means for a mother's ability to reconnect with their child. When in most states, women's parental rights can be terminated after 90 days of absence, then it is very unlikely that that family unit can be rebonded. So, anyone know who this beautiful woman is here? If I show you a different picture. This is Mary Virginia Jones. She was released from prison in California last week after serving 32 years in prison for a crime that she did not commit. 32 years for a woman who suffered at the hands of her abusive boyfriend. What do we owe people like Mary Virginia Jones, whose innocence has been shattered, life permanently changed because of our error? What then is the price of being wrong when we talk about mass incarceration and the punishments that accrue? Yes, there are some women behaving badly, but apparently not badly enough for politicians to take note and for philanthropic organizations to channel resources. And so even as I applauded the president's My Brother's Keeper initiative, I was haunted by this question. What about our daughters? Who will fight for them? Who will represent them and make sure that their voices and their experiences are included in this? Right? Anyone else a fan of Orange is the New Black? So I'm glad that it started some interest and conversation about the experiences of women in prison, right? But it provides this sort of glossy pop culture view when the reality is actually much grimmer. In this country, 1 in every 25 female inmates enters prison pregnant. What does that mean? That means that in 33 states in this country, pregnant women are shackled while they give birth. Even women whose only crime is being undocumented or crossing the border without authorization are subjected to this cruel and unusual treatment, forced to put their health and the health of their children at risk in order to uphold this law. It's no surprise then that detention centers in places like Maricopa County, Arizona, have been the sites of intense brutality against pregnant, undocumented women. This week, the legislature in Massachusetts passed a ban on inmate shackling during childbirth, and Governor Deval Patrick is expected to sign that into law. Other states like New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and even Iowa are considering similar legislation. So if you are from those states or you care about what happens to women and children in those states, I encourage you to reach out to those legislators and let them know no longer can we tolerate this brutality. So, how am I on time? Oh, great, perfect. So, when we talk about the erosion of our democratic rights, we have to also accept that justice for communities of color has never been a right of citizenship. Justice only comes through agitation and mobilization. We can sit back and complain about the arbitrary way that Florida decides who can stand their ground, or we can organize and mobilize to reverse those institutions. So I want to leave you with words from someone who I think was a powerful force in connecting politics and protests. And that is Chokwe Lumumba, who most recently was mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, and passed away unexpectedly last month. Mayor Lumumba is shown here with the Scott sisters, who he helped free from Mississippi prisons. These two women were serving double life sentences for a robbery that netted $11. Double life for an $11 robbery. Even more troubling is that 16 years into their sentence, the governor said, "We'll release you, but only if you promise that you will give your sister a kidney." Right? 16 years of your life for $11, and now you must commit to this medical act before we will allow you to be free. I keep thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer, who once said, "Is this America? Is this the America that we want or that we need?" And so Mayor Lumumba says the following: "You can't give up because the task is difficult. When the task is difficult, you get to work. That's what you do. You get down. So let's get to work. Let's get down." Thank you.
We'll be showing more of the conference in upcoming weeks. Before I move on, I want to note that Laura Poitras, Glenn Greenwald, and others have won the Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of Edward Snowden's revelations. The three have been reviled as traitors by the usual suspects. But as the public has realized that more and more of their privacy rights have been totally trampled upon, the three have become more popular and have been seen as whistleblowers and even heroes, hence the possibility of giving them the Pulitzer Prize. Now, Apartheid Adventures reveals the real reason for John Kerry's peace talks.
Apartheid Adventures would like to wish you happy peace talks. Now we know that some people are worried that peace negotiations will ruin their plans for a fun-filled vacation in Israel by giving away those great ski runs in the occupied Golan Heights, or losing those terrific Dead Sea beaches in the occupied West Bank where Ahava gets mud for their expensive body cosmetics. But there's no need to worry. Peace negotiations mean more Israel, and that means more Apartheid Adventures. What happened 20 years ago in 1993 with those Oslo peace talks? A Palestinian Authority? Don't you worry. The Palestinian Authority has no authority. Their only job is protecting you, if you're of the correct ethnic religious category, from themselves. Who has the real authority in the West Bank? Israel. That's why the West Bank has an Israeli military governor. And since those Oslo peace talks in 1993, the population of Israel's settlements in the West Bank has doubled. What about the Camp David II peace talks in the year 2000? No results, and more Israeli settlements. Taba peace talks a few months later, that was a close one, but Israel pulled out just in time, and more Israeli settlements. Peace negotiations this year, a few prisoners released, and more Israeli settlements. Peace talks never happen without more Israeli settlements, which means more and more Israel. Peace talks just keep the other side occupied and buy us time to build more places where your ethnic privilege is guaranteed by law, if you're the correct ethnic religious category. That's why for Israel, peace means keeping things just the way they are, but more of them. Israel, where peace talks are one more apartheid adventure. But how can we at Apartheid Adventures be certain that peace talks will always come out in our favor and won't ever interrupt your Apartheid Advantage fun-filled vacation in Israel? Don't you worry, there are 3 simple steps to winning peace talks every time. 1. Make sure your peace talks have an honest broker, and make sure the honest broker is always the United States. Because as the current U.S. mediator says, what's important here is we stand with Israel firmly, 100%. There's no distance between us. When the honest broker is 100% on your side, and also pays a big chunk of the other side's salaries, you know the negotiations will go your way or no way. 2. Only give away what you don't really want, and don't really give it away. For example, take the Gaza Strip. Please. We moved 8,000 Israeli settlers out of Gaza, and in the time it took us to do it, there were 20,000 more Israeli settlers in the West Bank. And did we give Gaza away? You tell us. Israel still controls Gaza's airspace, seacoast, water, electricity, borders, exports, imports, and food calorie intake, plus the Israeli military can enter at any time. And meanwhile, more settlements in the West Bank. Now that's a deal. And 3, keep apartheid on the table. When we demand as a precondition that the other side recognize Israel as the nation-state of our particular ethnic religious category, we're demanding that Israel is not of and for all its citizens, but that Israel is of and for you, if you're of the correct ethnic religious category, which is guaranteed to be the dominant majority for all time, regardless of any measures we have taken or might take to maintain that dominant ethnic majority status. Other people can live here, maybe even with equal rights, just not equal to us. Guaranteed ethnic dominance. Apartheid you can depend on. If the other side agrees to that little condition, then who knows, we might even agree to interim framework guidelines for further discussion that might include an entity for them that has some cosmetic similarities to a state. Flag, uniforms, government bureaucracy, corrupt officials, internal suppression, because they deserve the right to be suppressed by their own police, not just ours. Works for Gaza, why not the West Bank? So as long as we can keep flying over, entering with soldiers, controlling the borders, airspace, water, electricity, imports, exports, the Jordan Valley for an indefinite amount of time, special military outposts, and maybe even special enclaves where our people of the correct ethnic religious category can have special ethnic privilege, then count us in. Maybe for further discussion that might lead to framework guidelines for further discussion. And if they don't accept this terrific offer, well, everyone will blame them anyway. We'll just build some more settlements and we'll see them at the next round of peace talks. And the next round, and the next, and the next. Because as long as they keep talking, we keep building. Peace talks, protecting your ethnic privilege, or nothing doing.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.